Hello, everyone, and welcome to IGEL Weekly. I'm your host, Andy Whiteside. I've got Chris Feeney with me. Chris and I were having a really passionate conversation just now about the industry. So now we're gonna reset our gears and talk about this blog here from Jason Moffera. Did I say that right?
Mafera, sorry.
Moffera. I think I get that wrong almost every time. So sorry, Jason. The name of the blog is from, well, first of all, it's from May 15th, 2024. And the name of the blog is IGEL Response to CISA, CISA, Black Basta, Cybersecurity Advisory. And specifically, we're talking about healthcare as our example here, but not limited to healthcare by any means. Before I do that, though, let me throw this out there. If you're an IGEL customer or looking to be, which you should be, and my main message to you is you gotta stop running Windows on the endpoint if you don't need Windows on the endpoint. If you just do that, your security posture will go through the roof in terms of functionality and your security level. Sorry, Chris, I got an echo all of a sudden. I'm not sure where that came from. Um, but so Chris, why did we choose this blog today, and why does it matter that people understand how IGEL feels about the advisory announcement?
So, this year just seems like, it's been around for a while, these attacks on healthcare, but there's been some very large ones just this year alone, and most recently another one with Ascension Healthcare, I believe. And prior to that, the Change Healthcare one, and obviously, there have been similar challenges in other parts of the world. The NHS has been hit before over in the UK. And so, but what's been interesting is obviously, the sheer size and massive aftermath of what's happened when you literally take these organizations down and patients' lives are at risk, or just the whole underlying ecosystem of the payments, stuff like that. And so, um, obviously, iGel, we didn't build a product to try to address this. It's actually been really built from the ground up to live in a world that was untrusted. And but things naturally, as you might imagine, is that I'm sure you probably looked at the way the world was when you decided to go off and build XenTegra to try to solve something, and then things began to come your way. Uh, we kind of find ourselves in this position where, IGEL's preventive security model is already built to try to address some of these things that are now being, put out there from these government organizations. So, and then
So,
sorry, go
Chris,
ahead.
is it fair to say IGEL was built many, many, many years after Windows was built, and you got to see all the things that they did right at the time, but is wrong for modern day standards, specifically around security?
It's interesting. So IGEL is about 20, let me see, 23. I'm going to go with 23 years old, roughly. And Linux is maybe about 33 years old, roughly. We were about 10 years behind it, but so what is that? Early to late 90s, perhaps, something around that. So Windows 2000 wasn't yet out. The internet was becoming a thing. And people may be listening, hopefully there's some older folks like you and me that remember those days. But the younger folks, if you're listening, we didn't grow up in a world that had the internet always available, let alone the world networked, let alone the ability to have um, networks compromised or computers compromised. But IGEL certainly was built to live in an untrusted world as this began to remote computing, and so that untrusted world was basically the internet, essentially being on a thing like that where somebody could be scanning if you were not using firewalls or whatever like that, and then security posture wise was kind of built to be available up and running all the time, very little risk to the endpoint, and so that was sort of the beginning. If you look back on some of our corporate history slides, that was kind of sort of the focus was to build this read-only approach to remote computing, if you will.
Right. So let's walk through this section: preventive endpoint security for healthcare, all industries really. Three key takeaways. First one says organizations running IGEL as the endpoint OS significantly reduce risk of the endpoint of an attack vector, preventing ransomware and other incidents. Basically, what he's saying there is because it's not Windows and it's some version of Linux, the amount of attackable areas within the OS is greatly reduced because we're not really running a lot of random applications that haven't been vetted. That's step one, is it's not Windows, it's Linux, and it's a specific version of Linux, customized. Step one, it's not Windows.
And this really rang true as I was just reminiscing about this from when I came to IGEL. I'd heard about it, read about it, even played around with it every now and then before I came here. But then you get in front of customers where they're gonna, really test it out. And I had many situations where all I did was just put iGel on the device, didn't change any configuration, just sort of base out of the box, and then they would go off and do their scanning, and it came back always, very high in terms of I can't find anything, what's going on, and that type of stuff. And then of course we can always layer in, what I call a base config, which turns off some things like, hey, I'm going to turn off the ability to get to the setup menu. But right out of the gate, it was already in a much better posture, as far as like listening ports and stuff like that. Um, Whereas with Windows, I mean, just as an OS, you scan that, there's all kinds of things running behind the scenes, ports open, this, that, and the other. And so it's not built to be, hardened out of the gate. You have to harden it much before you even can find it in a usable. Whereas iGel was already built sort of to be handled that way. So
And Chris, I would say you just can't harden it. There's just, it's so capable and so functional, which that's why it was built. Um, that anything that there's always ways to exploit it. There always will. In fact, I mean, look, there's ways to exploit iGel, but man, you would really have to work hard to find them, and they're not obvious, and they haven't been built to be exploited. Whereas Windows, in theory, was built to be exploited because you could do anything with it, and then you have to go and reverse engineer to make it secure.
yeah, and we've had this discussion where you've got remote access to the device, or you've got physical access. Physical access to the device. If you don't have a lockdown config on it already, um, yeah, I mean, you can modify and change configurations. And so for us, for example, just out of the box, you'll have access to the setup menu, and you can go in there and modify it unless it's being managed and you lock that down, which you absolutely can do. And so what I ended up doing was I had sort of my security baseline config that I would just layer in, and it kind of maps to a lot of the stuff that we talk about in the preventative security model.
Yeah.
But it's just, things like basic, like remove access to setup, put a admin password on it. I mean, just basic stuff like that that you would want to do in production anyway.
So you're getting into a couple of things we're going to cover in a minute, but number two on the list of three key takeaways: integrate with multi-factor authentication solutions to reduce threat attacks. So number one, it's not Windows; it's a less capable operating system on purpose because it only does what you want it to do. And then number two, you integrate it with multi-factor authentication period, like you were just saying, but then multi-factor authentication, and you've just shut. Not only is it less attackable, but you've put a lock, a deadbolt on the front door that you have to have the key to the knob and the deadbolt to get in.
Absolutely. So that could be a variety of different solutions. So with OS 11, we had the ability to handle smart cards. With OS 12, similar thing. You can, but also integrate if you want to, before you get to the iGel desktop and anything behind that, you can set up integration with Intra ID, Okta, Ping, for example, or Workspace ONE, or in the healthcare sector, and we've got Imprivata. Obviously, you can force multi authentication before you allow access to what happens behind that afterwards, whether it's getting into a web browser or a virtual session. And so these are just part of iGel's posture to our partnerships and integrations.
And then finally, the third key takeaway is if you are running hardware that has Windows running it on top of it, it's not the hardware. I mean, is the hardware exploitable? Probably at the firmware level, but it's so incapable of doing a lot that why would you bother to exploit that when you can actually exploit the more powerful operating system on top of it? So what we talk about in number three here is if you have an exploited machine, you simply can boot from, say, a USB drive where you've obfuscated the hard drive from the scenario where all the software is living. And now you're really running the hardware on top of a new operating system, Linux, and you've circumvented the problem, which was the amazing, the powerful, the unbelievable Windows, which is what led to the problem to begin with.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've seen it happen firsthand, literally being uh, while an attack is occurring, an organization running around getting UD pockets configured and plugging them into devices in a preventative way, trying to prevent the device being hit. But then, of course, if it is hit, you can bypass the hard drive. We did a demo of this, for example, at our Disrupt conference. We also did at the HIMSS conference. We had a Windows laptop there that, we did a simulation of a ransomware attack, and then we just shut it down, booted to the UD pocket, and came right back up in just a few minutes. So.
Yeah. So, Chris, we've got this model here, the preventative security model, this diagram. We'll just go through it because it covers what's in the rest of the blog. And we'll just hit them pretty succinctly here. First and foremost, it's not Windows. We've established that. Multiple authentication capabilities, which you should leverage, and then the ability to use it in a pinch. But in this diagram here, we've got, first of all, centralized management is the key to all of this. But at the endpoint itself, we've got no local data.
None other than a config. I mean, you're not saving Word docs, you're not saving local documents, you're not saving PDFs or any of that stuff. None of that is happening.
Yeah. Like you would have to enable some way to do that. And by default, that's not turned on or encouraged.
Right. And even if you were somehow and on a reboot, it's not going to get saved. So, but at the end of the day, if a device gets stolen, let's take a laptop running IGEL on it, it gets stolen. There's no local configuration, there's no data on there other than the config, which you can also lock down if you wanted to. But even if you didn't take that extra step, it's still just a configuration. The user would still have to know how to get to stuff from there.
Yeah.
And it's not gonna be like, all of a sudden, all of Andy's secrets about how to run an Airbnb are now compromised for the world to see.
Yeah. Number 2 in here is read-only operating system.
Yeah. Again, one of the things that is removed out of the gate from is the ability to go and try to download software that it might be built for Linux or if it's Windows, right? None of that exists. We control all of that. But furthermore, the operating system is locked down so that the pieces that need to talk to each other to communicate and effectively run as an OS are there. But you can't try to modify or change or write. I mean, it's, you put a config on it and it's just reading that and then getting you the ability to do what you need to do from there from the world of end user computing.
Yeah.
So.
The third one here that I've got in the order I'm going is trusted. I'm going to add the word limited. Trusted and limited on purpose application platform.
So kind of going back to sort of for those folks that have been with IGEL for a while or know of it, in the prior approach, we had the OS, which we also called firmware, and it had the applications that we included into that. And those were obviously vetted and trusted to make sure that they were built and able to run on IGEL's operating system. In the world of OS 12, those apps are now separated out into a portal where you obviously those have to go through a vetting process and security review and all that stuff, especially if a partner is building them. But certainly if IGEL is building them, we have this mechanism to make sure that if that app is then installed on IGEL's OS, this read-only OS, that it is a secure, trusted application that is going to be verified to run correctly, not just some third-party thing that can just all of a sudden do some nefarious things.
Which in theory is a kind of an idea behind Linux to begin with, because it doesn't have this wide application development stack. It does, but it's not intended to be Windows, whereas Windows from day one has been like, it was literally wide open. The reason I'm a Windows administrator by original training is because I could steal it and steal applications and run it on top of there and learn. Can't do that with Linux. Well, you can't do that with an enterprise worthy version of Linux.
Yeah, like I said, it's we've had the ability to take Linux apps and then with the mechanism make them be able to run on IGEL in a read-only fashion. The real key thing is if I go and install it that way, which we usually refer to as our custom partitions, you do it in such a way that it's going to interact with the operating system correctly, but then on a reboot, it will retain, and still be there. But in order to be able to do that correctly, it has to go through this trusted application kind of process that we're talking about.
Yeah. All right, number, I don't know, 4 on the list here is MFA and single sign-on integration. We've kind of covered that already, but there seems to be a certain there's some guidance at IGEL that that's going to be a high priority part of the stack.
I think it comes down to like, what do you want the user experience to be? So do you want them to authenticate before they get to the OS underneath? And if so, then MFA is probably your way to go, or some kind of single sign-on component. Or just get to the OS desktop, and then from there you go to launch your session. Obviously, you want to put some MFA around that. And so um, whether it's a browser going to, I think you had it up earlier, you had a browser that would take you to applications, stuff like that, or maybe it's administrator console, whatever it is, but there's some sort of MFA involved, two-factor auth or what have you, and just native integration with those things. So that's what we've got there.
Yeah. I'm curious about this next one, data encryption. Is that local or is that in transit or both?
I think it's both. I mean, there is a component where you can put some encryption on the disk. And I happened to be in Germany a couple months ago, and I was asking them. I was in a security meeting, and I asked them specifically. And what that is it's nothing more than designing. Hey, if I've got a configuration on the device, you can do some disk encryption, to protect the configuration of the device. That's really about it. And there were some industries or customers or whatever that wanted that extra layer of security. So it's like, I definitely call it belt and suspenders approach, whereas the belt by itself definitely gets the job done. The suspenders is maybe just in case something happens. But it's really just protecting the configuration. It's not like there's data on the device like we talked about earlier. It's just the configuration of the device.
Right.
So that's on the endpoint. And then of course all the traffic in between where you're going is certainly encrypted. Like if you're going to Citrix or Horizon or Azure, whatever it might be, those connections, I mean, in today's world, if they're not encrypted, then you shouldn't be doing them, but they are. So
and then finally the last one, and I'm curious how this one applies to the no local data as well as the encrypted, and that's the modular design approach.
yeah, so that's like I said, in the OS 11 world, everything was sort of built into that firmware, and then you could kind of enable the things you wanted to, but you also had the ability to remove things you did not need. So if you were a Citrix shop and you didn't need the Horizon components built into the firm, you could remove those, and then the process would be it removes them out of that image. In the OS 12, it's the OS, and you layer on the pieces that you need. And so if you only need certain apps and none others, it's kind of that modular design. But even inside the operating system itself, the way we've kind of built it out, and we talk about this through our some of our security documentation. There's a link here to a security white paper that goes into more detail. But it's basically just saying, hey, these modules inside the OS itself, they're core and they're modularized so that they one doesn't kind of take over another or whatever. But then of course you then layer in the apps, which are also sort of in their little buckets, designed to interact with the parts of the OS that they need to. So for example, I need to put some certificates on the device. So we put those in a specific folder or a partition, I should say. And then you bring in a browser, then you bring in Citrix app or Horizon app, and they need to know how to talk to and find those certificates. So they're built to know exactly where in this modular design go to find them.
Yeah.
That type of approach.
So Chris, to kind of sum up this podcast, I would just say from a security perspective, specifically from a security perspective, when I meet with somebody, I ask them in the various use cases and scenarios we're talking about, are they running Windows on the endpoint and why? I'm not saying it's wrong. Just tell me why. And there's a blend between, it's just what we do. I don't know any better, and user experience. But then you got to factor in the security one. And I literally want every customer and every single workflow and use case to tell me why they're running Windows on the endpoint versus some type of delivered model, which could just be a browser. and a more secure, enterprise-worthy, manageable, because we go back to the center of this design, and that's a management console that has control over all this environment, and it's not this crazy, distributed architecture that Microsoft has, which was great in the beginning, when we hadn't had networks like we had then, but you just don't need it anymore.
Yeah.
Why when
Well, I
why
think,
why are people running Windows? They need to be able to answer that question. If they can't answer that question, somebody needs to challenge them.
well, I think, especially on the healthcare side, but it's we've talked about this in general many times on this podcast. At the end of the day, the user's needing to get to an app of some kind. And then it's the user experience around that. For example, do you put a front door on that experience where they have to authenticate first, and then to make it easier, they just click on something and they kind of get logged in, that single sign-on experience? Or if you don't need that, you just have them pull up whatever's available and then they authenticate, they get to their stuff. An OS is an OS. At the end of the day, if I get an iPad, I'm not getting the iPad because of the cool operating system. I'm using apps on that iPad, and so understanding like why are you using Windows as your endpoint OS? Well, I need them to get to this, that, or the other. Okay. Can that be done just through a browser? Do you have MFA in front of that? I mean, just all kinds of things, right? And just rethinking the user experience, right? Does everybody need to have the same experience? Or do you need to have certain user personas, whatever? You know, and you've done a really amazing job of kind of trying to challenge that. And that's obviously what IGEL's focus on is this disruptive nature of rethinking how you are doing endpoint management. And if you're not thinking about security right out of the gate, you're doing it wrong. So
Right. I mean, it's fine if the answer is Windows, but there should be the reason why you're running Windows, not
yeah,
excuse.
I mean that's saying there's gonna be some legitimate scenarios where yeah, we do need it. Okay, it's fine. But there's plenty of other situations where you may not need to. So
Well, Chris, I think we covered it. Short messages, security matters, user experience matters, enterprise management abilities matter. IGEL has a solution for that entire stack, but from this perspective, from a security perspective, it's it needs to be considered.
yeah, absolutely. And I think like every organization, I've had multiple conversations. You probably have too. You got to find the right balance between security and convenience, and that's always been sort of the dance, if you will. What is the right approach in healthcare? You've got to take into account how people use machines, how they use technology. They're not always all carrying around a laptop that they don't share. There's shared workstations, there's non-shared work, there's all kinds of scenarios, and finding the best approach and then marrying the security and convenience factor.
Yeah.
Um,
We've got one large healthcare customer now moving the entire organization, thousands of people to Apple.
Somebody sold them on that. I'm very curious. I'm sure there's a good reason for it or not.
It was a
Um,
C-level's idea, and he controls the purse strings, and that's what they're going to do. And to be honest, from a functionality and from a security perspective, I don't know that I fault them for that. The cost is just going to be astronomically high to maintain.
it's interesting. So James Millington, he tells a story before he came to IGEL. He's at another organization, and they just use a browser for everything. Just a browser. They're using Google Apps or whatever, but yet they sent him a really expensive Mac, which he technically didn't need. He just needed something that was functional that would help him open up a browser and do his job. But it didn't require a really nice, expensive Mac. And Macs are nice, so are other devices. But yeah, so that'll be interesting to see. Um, but sometimes you have situations like that where, and Mac's secure, not completely 100%, but it's secure. Anyways, but IGEL is very secure as well and built that way from the ground up. So
Chris, I'll let you go. Thanks for taking the time to cover this today.
always a pleasure, Andy. Thank you, brother.
See you in 2 weeks.
See ya.